Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for
So,
the invite.
so the context for this, guys, as you know, this is kind of what we call the Foundations series, Foundations being plural, because we want to talk to different attorneys about the various ways they've laid out their faith within different contexts, different subject matters, practice areas, hence the nature of the plural foundations. You're going to look different as a Christian in torts, criminal reform, construction design, all that stuff. So I wanted to talk to you guys because you guys recently spoke at one of our chapters, I believe at Stetson and quote unquote Tampa Bay. I believe there's another city that it's located in, but they were, raving about some of the insights you guys have gained as far as kind of constructing a firm in a very unique sense, Christian, but really faith-centered, and the way that you guys kind of orchestrated the way the legal practice could look for a lot of different firms that want to impose some form of a faith, um, tradition, custom. So that's how you guys got here. But I don't want to kind of go into this too far. I want to talk to you guys about the nature of this organization. Boatman Ricci. So I was hoping that Jim, Steve, you guys can maybe in that order can talk to me a little bit about how you guys got to where you're at now with this organization, and also along this journey, talk to me about what it's like being a Christian in your respective law schools.
Well, thank you very much, Anton, and thank you for all the work and intentionality that you do through the Christian Legal Society. It's been a wonderful inroad for us because we travel to law schools throughout Florida to talk about the kingdom approach that we take to running a law firm, because we think, the author of all things good is as good a source for defining how you run an organization as any. And so the fact that we can show up and know that we have to some extent a like-minded audience, especially with young law students, it's really fantastic because there's a lot of synergies that evolve out of that. So thank you for your intentionality at the national level. Um, so with regard to Boatman Ritchie, over the course of several years, I started the firm back in 2007. It was just the Boatman Law Firm. And thankfully, God didn't leave me on my own in this undertaking. And through the course of our business growth, I was blessed with like-minded partners, one of whom has joined us, Stephen Scherer. And and over the course of time, we feel like the Holy Spirit has revealed to us sort of the highest and best form of a law firm. And it starts with culture.
Hmm.
And we ultimately went back to our corporate documents, and we have officially organized the firm with Christian values and built on the truth of the nature of Jesus Christ. And so uh, I think the tricky part of that is, well, how do you make sure that that has the macro inclusive effect and doesn't have an exclusionary effect?
Hmm.
Um, not just because it's a breach of federal law to not employ Christians, but also it seems to us very unchristlike. So we've carefully worked through that, and it's just part of our mantra that the Christian core foundation of our firm uh, is ultimately Christ, uh, and the invitation of Christ and his reach was offered to everyone.
Hmm.
And so it would be very unchristian like for us to exclude people because they don't buy into who we say God is, or don't believe in what we say God is. And so what we say, as a matter of culture, is that whether Jesus really was the Son of God or whether he was just somebody who was just very well intentioned, there are worse mantras and philosophies to live under than servant leadership, and there are worse things to die under or to live under than the idea of dying for others.
Hmm.
So whether or not we just have a philosophy of a crazy guy who was well intended, or whether it is God inspired, it's not the worst culture to live
Hmm.
within, especially if people come aboard and they don't believe in Jesus. We're totally fine with that, but we're going to operate from these values. So that's where we start. We make sure that this is what the founders believe in, but whether you're an atheist or a Muslim, we're going to love you just the same because that's the most Christ-like approach we could take. So
Yep.
that's kind of the seed crystal from where we start. And then there's lots of layers from there.
Yeah, I'm glad you unpacked it a little bit as a foundation. Before I get to Stephen, Jim, talk to me a little bit about what you were like in law school. I suspect people are probably assuming you were CLS chapter president. You were completely gung-ho about doing this kind of work. Then the second you got out of law school, passed the bar, started legal practice, you immediately said, I got to implement my faith in my legal practice. However, I'm assuming that. Is that true? Is that how you were? How did you make that transition from law school to legal practice and to have what you just described be kind of the identifying marker in your practice?
Well, my encouragement is this. I was a, a double-minded, backslid, lukewarm, Christmas and Easter only type guy in law school who drank too much on the weekends and blah blah blah. So I find myself where I am now as a function of the grace of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit transforming me from one degree of glory to the next and revealing things about himself over the course of time.
Mm.
So I wasn't who I am now at any level. But I was saved, I believe, but in terms of the sanctification, I was closer to the earliest gestation of that in law school. But Stephen would be a better guy to ask about that. I think he was a little bit farther along by the time he got to college. I think he was farther along than me, really close to birth, actually. He's one of these guys that's just been walking the walk for a long time. Me, it's been in the last, 15 or 20 years.
Stephen.
Yeah, so Jim talked a lot about culture, and culture begins with people. So let me tell you kind of my background. I went to law school. I joke I went to law school kicking and screaming. I told God no, I don't know how many times. But so I could tell you all the different roadblocks I put up. But I felt a firm call to go to law school of all things. I'm the only lawyer in my family. I have no background. I had no idea what lawyers actually do. No idea what the practice law would look like, but God said go, so I went. So I ended up going to law school at Liberty University, which is, a great place to go to law school for a Christian. And you know, I ended up in a very supportive and Christian environment. I went to a secular school through undergrad and graduate school, and so I wanted to be in a Christian environment. I told the Lord, I said, well, if I'm going to go to law school, I'm not going to one of these, cutthroat places. I'm just not doing it. And so, through the grace of God, I ended up at Liberty, and fabulous. I could probably spend the next hour talking about Liberty, but I won't. I'll fast forward. So my first year of law school, I meet Jim Boatman through a mutual friend of ours, through a Christian. Jim and him were in a Christian CEO group together called C12. And so I reached out to my friend when I needed a job, and I said, "Hey, I need a job. Do you know any lawyers?" And it'd be a super bonus if they were Christian lawyers. And he said, "Why don't you go talk to this guy, Jim Boatman? I'll make the introduction." And so we met. I think we sat together for a couple hours, and after a couple hours, he's like, "I guess I ought to look at your resume." Because we just hit it off. We started, and what was funny is we didn't even really talk about law school, job, and we started talking about. I think we started watching. Oh, I can't remember the name of the video series. Anyway, Real Christian Life or something. These YouTube videos of these guys going around and practicing their faith out in the open and healing. We started talking about anything, theological issues. And so we really hit it off. And so then I went to work with Jim, and Ernie at the time was an associate at the firm. And what I saw when I came to Boatman Ricci was, Jim really viewed our conference room as a mission field.
Mm.
And that to me was something I'd never even heard of, thought of, seen before. I can't tell you the amount of times we would sit in a consultation and a simple conversation like, hey, you know, do you, I don't know what you do, but I typically, when I make a hard decision, I like to pray about it. Do you pray?
Mm.
Yeah, well, and then you get this long story about it, their history with church or faith, and you see that God would begin to work in people's lives, and I could give you testimony after testimony. And what I saw was that the law and what we did in solving people's real world problems could be a tool that God could use to reach people in their darkest hour. And that to me was something that was so beautiful and so worth it that I often told people, I said, well, if I have to be a lawyer, at least I get to do that.
Mm.
Right. And so that, and that really kind of kicked it off. It grew from there of this idea that, hey, we can do more with what God has given us. And I watched Jim demonstrate that all throughout my years in law school and then joining as an associate in the firm. And it slowly turned into this idea that this is what we're going to be about, which is what attracted me really to work with Jim and Ernie in the first place.
That's a great foundation, guys. Talk to me about the culture. Obviously, at the heart of this blueprint that you guys provided for me, I'm not sure if this is public record. I'm not sure this is just something you
You
can.
can, yes, it is. It's not public record, but it's open for dissemination.
Sweet,
Yeah.
sweet. So in it, at the heart of your, I think, blueprint, also at the heart of your culture, you got these two things: truth guided and relationship driven. Can you talk to me about those two concepts? I'm not going to point out which one of you should kind of volunteer and answer, but I want to kind of throw it out to you guys to talk to me about why the truth guided and the relationship driven aspect of this is so important, and then also how this actually looks in practice, since planning and implementing are two very different things.
Well, truth guided relationship driven. When I started the firm in 2007, and I was processing through, what it would look like and the logo and everything else. I don't know, the concept of truth guided relationship driven, it just popped into my mind. And most firms don't have like a motto. I think that by some standards, maybe it I don't know, it seems a little hokey or something. I don't know, but I just felt it was important to really amplify that. And in my mind at that time, it wasn't really fully revealed to me, and I kind of thought I came up with it on my own. The idea of being truth guided was, I really believe that truth, when articulated, like factual truth, resonates uniquely to the listener. So if you're going to go have to make an argument,
Hmm.
if you're making an argument based upon the truth, you have like an unfair advantage over someone who's having to argue from a different position. And so that was my idea of truth guided, that we wouldn't represent liars and thieves. And the relationship driven was just the fact that I was committed to the relationship between the firm and the client. Later on, a couple of years, well, gosh, it was several years later, I felt like God revealed to me that you missed it a little bit. The truth guided is Jesus is the truth personified, and so and the Holy Spirit is what's going to guide you, the Spirit of truth. And so that's what I meant by truth guided. And relationship driven is that vertical relationship with the Father. And so that's ultimately what that's like our, if you look at our logo, it looks like a compass rose, but it's not a north-south compass. It's a vertical compass. It's a moral compass.
Hmm.
And so that's what truth guided relationship driven means to us. And um, we use it as a pole star. Obviously, we have a full set of values and we have a mission statement, but everything starts kind of there at the truth guided relationship driven.
And I think, you know, that's the birth story. And as it became what it is today, um, you know, you asked, how does that work out in practice? Well, if we put everything through the matrix of is it truth guided and relationship driven with that in mind, you start to begin to see that, you know, as a firm, I often call them concentric circles, right? our area of influence expands. So it's not just in it's in how we treat each other. So everything we do as a firm with respect to our employees, those who come to work for us, whether for a season or for the rest of their lives, is going to be driven. It's going to be truth guided and relationship driven, right? It's going to be guided under those values. And then the same applies how we treat our clients. We encourage our team. And I tell folks all the time when they come and interview, it's like, I want you to feel empowered to be a lawyer, to advance the cause of truth, right? That's what we want for you. We want, and so in how we treat our clients and how we treat opposing counsel and everything is through that lens. And then it goes out further and how we treat the general public and take care of our community. So as your mission field expands, but it's through that matrix. And that's what the firm blueprint is really built off of, right? Is okay. So then we sat down and said, well, what does that actually mean? Right? What is it if that's who we are and if that's who we want to be, because it's always to an extent aspirational, right? We're always at a different stage of our sanctification. But if that's what does that actually mean? And that's what the blueprint goes on to describe. Well, how do we treat employees? How do we treat other people? How do we love others in under this matrix and under this core belief that we have as a firm?
Let me unpack that a little bit more, especially because there's so much to discuss from a relational aspect of it. You mentioned, Stephen, just now about client and opposing counsel relationships, which is much easier said than done because of how opposing counsel, for the most part, tend to be relatively unsavory in the legal field because of the advantages of being, hostile and adversarial. But obviously, clients themselves are not going to be bringing to you all the information. They're going to be kind of filtering all of this in the context of what's favorable to them and what you need to know to try to advance their case, and more primarily to even take on your case from an intake stage. So, talk to me about how truth itself animates the culture of the firm when you know that the legal profession itself is a lot of times hinged on forms of deception. How do you navigate those challenges, especially in your field?
Well, I guess from the perspective of when we first have a client in front of us in an initial consultation, I think and I know that one of the most important gifts that the Holy Spirit affords us is discernment.
Hmm.
So when we're hearing from clients and when we're working through the initial case assessment, we generally amplify the fact that we need to understand what actually occurred and we need to know the truth what occurred so that we can best provide you guidance. And I encourage people that there may be things about your story that you're not proud about or that you think don't help you. Don't filter that out. We need to hear everything, and then we can give you the best, wisest counsel from a position of sort of factual truth.
Hmm.
And so then there's just that outgrowth from there. When it comes to the opposing counsel, there's only so much you can do. If someone is representing a liar and a thief, and maybe they either don't realize they're a liar and a thief, or maybe they don't care. At the end of the day, we're operating within a judicial system that is fallen and corrupt.
Hmm.
And the one thing that I try to do for clients is I help them understand and have an accurate expectation vis-a-vis what they can hope to derive from the judicial system. They're not going to get justice in the form of pure justice. They're going to get some really usually expensive and dissatisfying form of justice. And so I think expectationally it's important, to address that. And with regard to opposing counsel, again, who want to, speak in untruth or be aggressive or overplay their hand, I use 57105 a lot, which is a safe harbor mechanism. That's the state statute, and there's Rule 11. So if I believe that I'm representing somebody who's telling the truth, and I have an opposing counsel who is proceeding on the basis of facts which I don't think are supported, then I do my best to edify that opposing counsel as early as possible in a way that's, not saber rattling or chest pounding, but it's based upon the fact that Rule 11 and these sanctions mechanisms are really a function of the ethical obligation that we owe our clients and the court system. And I try to make sure that I give them the best opportunity to assess the real facts. And then I just warn them. I say, this provides you an opportunity, and I might provide a declaration or an affidavit. This provides you an opportunity to go back to your client and make sure that you guys are proceeding on sound facts. Otherwise, at the end of this process, I may be in a place where I have to then come back, and after we've defeated your claim or defense because it's not supported by the case or the law, and it really never had a chance, to then bring to the court's attention the fact that I gave you an opportunity to do the right thing. So in practice, that's one example of how I might use this idea of being truth guided in a communication with a client, but also in communication with the opposing counsel, but do so in a way that's relationship driven, where I am giving the opposing counsel, a chance to sort of save face and maybe revise their pleading or drop it completely.
Steven, it seems you got something else to say about that, man, especially this tension that I was mentioning between the profession and your own kind of pursuit of truth and trying to make sure that truth itself is rooted at the heart of your identity. And I like what Jim's talked about as far as your relationship with opposing counsel, of providing them enough information for them to make the ethical decision to back off when they've lost. And I think it's one of the things that lawyers don't do very well, which is humble themselves and knowing when you've lost a case, and you can kind of maybe find a middle ground or maybe some form of mediation or negotiation, but certainly understanding that you're now at a point where you need to start to de-escalate things and try to, wrap things up, and instead of double down and try to, win on appeal by having judges make mistakes down the road.
Into that, that relationship side and how we treat opposing counsel when you have somebody who is particularly unsavory. Truth often wins the day, but also you don't have to, as a Christian, right? I don't have to stoop to that level. That can be hard, right? That's hard sometimes. But as a representative of Christ, as an ambassador for Christ, I have to remind myself that my representation is important to him. And so I don't need to win points, right? I need to represent Christ well. I need to represent my client well. You can be firm and kind at the same time. You can. And so practicing that out and being relationship driven is huge. I mean, I've won opposing counsels over by the end of a case because I tell them from the beginning, I am who I am from the start of this through the end. What you hear from me is what's going to happen. And what I say, I'm going to do. And when they, at first they're all like, yeah, sure, everybody says that, right? And it's not a pride thing. I'm just saying, you don't, when you prove that to them, even with somebody who's exceedingly difficult, by the end of the case, you start to see a different side of them because they're like, okay, no, this guy's not gonna, I also, when you don't stoop to their level, they don't score any points by doing that. And so you often get a better outcome for your client anyway.
Yeah, taking the bait from an opposing counsel who operates, in a way that's designed to usually people who are aggressive and overly so. It's a mechanism that they've either developed over the course of time, or it's just a character flaw. And if you show them grace and you don't take the bait, very quickly in any long-term dynamic, you're going to demonstrate a higher level of strength and a higher level of efficacy in terms of making the most compelling case, whether it's in front of the judge or in an exchange of communication. Being overly aggressive and overplaying your hand and pushing buttons, it generally results in futility if that is being utilized against someone who doesn't take offense. What we last year, the book Unoffendable was required reading at the firm, because the only way you're going to be thrown off by an attorney on the other side who wants to get aggressive and act like a bully, is if you allow him to offend you. And when you have clients and when you have younger lawyers and when you have people that watch you lead from a position where you're not offendable and they watch the darts just pass through you, because a dart only hits the flesh, it doesn't hit the spirit.
Mm.
And it's actually just a higher way to operate as a lawyer. And your stress levels, when you can learn how not to take the bait, your stress levels come down. I have, I have one of those aura rings where I'm constantly told like what my engagement or stress level is, and I love it. And I'm just learning how to like literally affect my physiology by not taking the bait from the opposing counsel.
And to the point of being truth guided, you mentioned, how do you handle that with clients? Because they obviously come in with
Mm.
a case to prove, right? Often. So they want to tell the lawyer what he wants to hear or what they think the lawyer wants to hear. And Jim kind of amplified this, but also give you an example, right? Sat down with a client in a conference room and I asked them some questions in litigation, right? And the answer came out like this. Well, what would be better for my case? And I said, I'm going to stop you right there. I said, I'm not ever going to answer that question because you're going to tell me what happened. You're not going to, in that point. And so truth guided relationship driven is on my wall out here. It's on our wall at the front of the firm. And I look them in the face and I say, look, you got to understand something about me. Um, truth guided relationship driven is not just something that I put on the wall because it sounds good. It is in fact who I am.
Mm.
And so I want to be very clear from the beginning and at this point in our relationship that I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I don't want, because I can deal with bad facts, I can deal with mistakes, right? But I can't deal with them if you don't tell me them. And I'm very upfront and very straightforward with clients. And oftentimes, you know, they're sometimes clients with experience with lawyers, they're surprised to hear that. I'm like, look, the facts are what they are, right? We can make the arguments from them. We can make the best of what we have with this situation, but we're not going to start from a place of dishonesty. And that would dishonor who I serve, and that would dishonor you as the client if I were to advise you to do that. And so I'm very straightforward with that from a client perspective.
I, I love the way you guys are talking about this because I think The Art of Disagreement, this is a book by Gavin Ortland that just came out a couple of months ago. I think it's a very unspoken practice area within the legal profession. And obviously, people go to like Romans 12 to talk about not being overcome by evil, but overcoming evil with good. They go to James 1 and talk about being slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. But I love the title of that book. And obviously, the book itself, it's very short, but The Art of Disagreement is a great title because I've been studying art history a lot for the last couple of years and just understanding the ongoing conversation that artists have between each other on the techniques of painting and what they're trying to embody in their work really speaks to the kind of forms of disagreement we could be having, but people don't actually talk about how to disagree well and different techniques of disagreeing in various ways to open up conversations. There's a great book also by a guy named Stephen Collis, who's a professor at University of Texas law, and he talks about opening up spaces for constructive conversations. But the art of disagreeing to me is a very important part of legal practice if you want to embody that type of custom and tradition and reputation among other law firms. And I practiced in Atlanta for a while, and people get to know you, and judges get to know you. And over time, you begin to generate reputation for being a certain type of lawyer. And hopefully, in your case, obviously, it's one that's going to be shrewd, but also honest and trustworthy. I'm wondering how this works from the standpoint of margins of victory. And let me explain it this way. Some people ask me, can you be a good Christian and a good attorney? Because being a good attorney and winning cases requires you to be deceitful at times, and being a good Christian doesn't allow for that form of latitude. How have you guys found tensions in regards to being a good Christian and being a good attorney from the standpoint of being successful in representing your clients?
I think that there's just a profound deception in the idea that uh, the ability to deceive ultimately yields some sort of lasting benefit.
Mm.
Because if we start from the standpoint that, I mean, if God is really real, if everything that we believe to be true is in fact true, and he is the provider of all things that are good, well, then how could being deceptive ultimately yield an outcome that by any meaningful measure is actually of higher value than an outcome derived from truth? So I think that I would say that I've never seen a situation. I mean, somebody can have a Pyrrhic victory, a temporary victory, um, maybe in the context of uh, some worldly outcome that that amounts to winning a battle but losing a war, potentially by using deception. But even from that standpoint, I've never been involved in a case. I mean, I guess I've been involved in cases where I wish the facts were different. But when you really look at the measure of evidence and you look at the fact that you're going to have to take this evidence and you're going to have to take it before, either a judge or a group of people who are going to have to themselves discern, either through their experience or otherwise, what really happened. I mean, what is the likelihood out of 100 times that I'm going to go in there with deception and repeatedly convince different sets of people that something occurred that is in dissonance with what actually occurred? I think that's a fool's errand, and I don't think it's a very good place to start. If you have a client that comes to you with a bad set of facts, I think it's an awesome opportunity for you to speak into the situation like real wisdom.
Mm.
And that's why I think, and I've experienced, I spend as much of my time talking people, you know, out of the utilization of my services as anything.
Mm.
Because when we process through the information, as long as they've told me the truth, and we conclude that, well, the only way that you're going to succeed in this situation is if someone believes this set of facts that is in dissonance with what actually happened, that's just not a great way for you to spend your resources. And so, I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that don't make a living taking bad facts and pitching them to try to get the best outcome. In fact, I would say that if you look at the ethical requirements and really focusing on our criminal system, the adversarial system, whereby even a person who's guilty should be afforded and must be afforded, in order for our system to work, must be afforded the greatest possible defense necessary. Um, Obviously, that person needs an excellent defense. But when you look at the ethics between, well, okay, so how good of a defense are they supposed to get? Do we allow the lawyer to put the defendant on the stand to lie?
Mm.
Well, I think you come up against the ethical norms, and it's not afforded within the scope of ethics. So you have to do the best you can for the person within the constraints of the truth. So at the end of the day, no, I don't think that there's any dissonance at all between operating and representing people within the fallen system of the judicial system, but operating from a kingdom norm, which is from a place of actual truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Stephen, I guess I want to see what you have to say as far as kind of your experience so far between this tension, perhaps tension, between being a good Christian and a good attorney, whether or not one or the other is going to be impacting your ability to fulfill the second piece of that puzzle.
I personally, so I used to get that question a lot from people who are non-lawyers when I was in law school. They're like, they used to think Christian, because Liberty University is a Christian, evangelical Christian university. So they'd say, Christian law school, isn't that an oxymoron? Christian lawyer? That doesn't make any sense. And, I would talk through that with them, and it's most people's misconception. You don't have to be it's often thought you have to be a good liar to be a good lawyer. I don't lie in my practice. I don't. And I tell clients that. I'm not going to lie for you. And I'm not going to argue positions that are untrue. I'm just not. And to me, there's no disadvantage. My clients have suffered no additional harm And I have suffered no additional harm as a professional. And in fact, at the end of the day, our adversarial position or system is designed to find the truth. That's what we're looking for ultimately. The jury's job is to try to find the truth. Do they always get it right? No, because I tell clients all the time, the people making the decisions are human beings. Whether they're a judge or a six-member jury, they're human beings who have to interpret facts, look at witnesses, decide who to believe, right? So do they get it wrong? Absolutely, every day. But at the end of the day, we're after truth. That's what the system is built on. So no, I don't I think it's a myth. I don't think in order to be a good lawyer you need to lie, cheat, steal. I I I think you're actually not a good lawyer if you feel like you have to do those things in order to advance the cause. And I think you have to take a long, hard look at what the cause actually is.
Because if you're representing people that need you to lie, there's probably like a higher calling for you in the moment to be a counselor at law to really try and guide that individual to a better decision ultimately about how they handle the circumstances within which they find themselves.
Hmm. The big thing I was thinking about is why I think your approach is difficult, but also so important is because you want to create a relationship with truth that is going to be ongoing, not just the intake stage where the clients gives you some pretty favorable facts and you realize, okay, this might be a winnable case. But then as you develop the record itself, you're going to get information that you didn't get from the client because the client's filtering of the circumstances is not exactly what happened. And there's things that the employer or the other side have done that has actually kind of insulated them from any type of responsibility. So having that relationship with truth and being guided by that requires you to kind of develop an emotional intelligence to be able to update the state of your relationship with the client. And I think that's an important thing that students have to understand that the law profession is always in a state of flux and uncertainty. And that you've got to have the emotional intelligence, obviously the character to be able to adjust accordingly with new information, which usually is not what I've seen in the legal profession, in my experience, being in the practice for a little bit, is that usually new facts are facts that are inconvenient, are usually ignored and not considered and not incorporated into your brief. I know that a lot of times whenever you write a brief, you're supposed to say, but see this other case, but I almost never see but see anything in other people's briefs. I try to incorporate that as well, but then I was kind of taught not to do that so much. And so there's a minimal threshold for honesty, but it's not a full scale appreciation for truth as you guys were talking about. So I think it's good for students to start really harnessing that relationship with truth and being guided by that and being defined by that. Jim, let me ask you this, and then Stephen, obviously piggyback off some of the things that Jim talks about. I want to kind of go back to what you talked about earlier as far as assigning books, which is music to my ears. And I want to talk about the internal development of the staff itself, because we talked about the external relationships you guys have with clients and opposing counsel. What does it look like to generate the kind of climate and culture you want internally with people who are coming in, who are new, who are obviously potentially have different faith backgrounds? What does that look like in practice for you guys? From a day-to-day standpoint, how do you guys create that harmony with so many different perspectives coming in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I would say, there's always this sort of developing process in the firm management. So let me tell you how we're doing it now and how we've done it over the last couple of years, because that's the best example. I'm not gonna tell you about version 1.0. Let's talk about version 3.4. So I felt like the Holy Spirit gave me this idea of a firm blueprint, that a document that would be available to anybody that wanted to see it, that would describe the firm history, uh, uh, the firm culture, essentially try to tell people who we're trying to be. Like, here's our DNA. Because if someone joins you based upon who you say you are, well, when they join you, they're going to help you become more of what you want to be, right? There's this inertia. There's like, well, that sounds attractive, and I'm going to join them. And as long as we have this authentic place where people can give feedback and then participate, then if if you're not doing something that's in this firm blueprint and they can hold you accountable to it, then that just helps you become, like I say, more of who you say you want to be. And so the firm blueprint is a great place to start with understanding our firm culture, where we sort of lay out the values and the mission, et cetera. And then there's lots of different features. The way that we look at succession planning,
Yeah.
when it's not just about the old guy heading off, to retirement, but succession planning having to do with, as a paralegal, what is the paralegal dreaming about in 8 years? How can we help the paralegal achieve that? Like what can happen in that person's life? How can the firm be a blessing? Whether you look at the transparency of how we handle money, how we split up a dollar, how do you matriculate from being a summer clerk like Steven Scherer was to an equity partner like he's become in 7 or 8 years, so so when you're going to walk out this truth guided relationship intentionality, and you're going to do it from a kingdom place, it starts with a document that people can read through and understand and either find attractive or not find it so attractive. There may be people that read that document, they're like, sounds too preachy or too idealistic or whatever. Quite frankly, most of the people that we've given the document to have really been encouraged by it. And since they've joined us, they've helped us become, more of who we say we want to be.
Hmm.
And then with the blueprint, the other thing that we have started doing is annual vision meetings. Annual vision meetings are times when everybody at the firm get together and they hear from leadership what has happened in the last year and what we see God pointing us to in the coming year. We have KPIs. So as a business, we run the organization and we steward it well. And those vision meetings don't happen if we don't have strategic annual meetings with the leadership, 6 months before those vision meetings. So, it's a process, but once you establish this rhythm where you have a document you're held accountable to, you plan strategically with KPIs and, like world-class assessment methodologies, and then you cast vision and then you hold people accountable to that vision. It's something that has coalesced, really well. And we could talk for a long time about the features of our culture, but even though we're a hybrid organization, we all spend a lot of time together and we use Zoom to do that. We have staff meetings that are regularly held that everybody's on. The first half of our staff meeting is all about going over, the different channels in our firm tech stack, which is Slack driven, that are kingdom focused. Like we have prayer requests, or we have Kingdom Chronicles where people have put information about either devotionals or something that God has done in their life. And so that's the first half. We front load all of our culture with God stuff. And we do so in such a way where we always say very honestly, listen, if you're not into this spiritual God stuff, philosophical, however you want to look at it, it is totally fine. You don't even have to show up. You can cancel your camera. Nobody's going to think another thing about it. But then we process through that information. So those are just some of the ways that we try to really manifest, this kingdom-minded law firm.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be values forward, right? So I talked about how we make decisions through that lens of being truth guided, relationship driven. So it's that, right? So we build in these rhythms of how we interact with our team, but also and who we pick to be on the team, right? And we put our values forward, right? I always tell folks sometimes I when I talk to them in um, the interview, I say, look, it would be unfair to you if I didn't tell you who we are. And so, I said because if you shouldn't walk in here and not know who you're walking with, right? And so we try to be as values forward as possible throughout that, and that just it almost looks like a feedback loop, right? It reinforces that culture when you say these are our values. Okay, this is who we are. Then we start making decisions through this lens. It just starts reinforcing itself, so that people start thinking through their decisions through the values that we've set forward.
One of the things I noticed about your blueprint is, and this is explicit at times, but implicit in many other sections, is the importance that you guys put towards employees taking ownership of their own growth. Is that part of the culture? You have a line that says the firm is looking for people who want to be on a path of self-growth. I always connect that with the idea of agency, which usually contributes to dignity. The more agency a person is given, the more I think he's given their ability to really fully embrace their dignity. And I think that, the opposite is also a fact whenever big law firms give their first year associates absolutely no room to be creative, to be independent. It does have a dehumanizing effect on them, and that's usually why a lot of them burn out after a couple of years because they just feel like they're not really, able to exercise the full scope of their humanity. They're kind of just machines or clogs or instruments for the bottom line game aims of the firm. But can you talk to me a little bit about this idea, if it's true that this idea of wanting to create independent, self-growing, self-developing agents while also putting them in a position to be successful in that? Is that part of your culture?
Absolutely. One of our values is exceptionalism. And so to be exceptional is to strive to walk out in one's unique gifting and attributes with excellence. And so if you're going to be exceptional, that's going to require sort of a self motivating or intentionality. You have to have an intentionality. If you're not an intentional person, you're probably not going to thrive in this type of environment. So we want people to walk out their identity that God created them to walk out. And if they've joined this firm, they're going to have an excellent opportunity for that, because I mean, we actually come from a place where we hold loosely to the people that we hire. And when I say that, I mean that if someone comes to us and they have an interest in the firm and we help them build and grow, but then they ultimately feel led to go elsewhere, instead of being clingy or negative, if they want to transition onward, if that's part of their healthy succession, we actually encourage that. The only thing that we ask is that people give us sufficient time, and don't shortchange us. That where this 2 week notice came from, I want to choke the person out that ever came up with the idea of a 2 week notice, because 2 week notice isn't even time. It's not time enough to replace anybody in an organization, whether it's a receptionist or whether it's an associate. But so my point is that we want to serve people and facilitate their walking out of their God-given gifts. And if they come to us because they find our kingdom stated mindset to be in alignment with where they want to be, and if they want to be a lawyer, they want to be a legal assistant, they come to us, then they know that they're going to have a place where we're going to seek to foster their individual growth. And from our blueprint, we've already said we're going to hold loosely to you. So if you end up, your family transitions out, or you decide that you want to try the big firm paradigm, you don't have this classic negativity with an employer who's going to sort of be open to burning bridges, or you give your notice and all of a sudden, we're telling you just to don't even work out your notice and leave. That's in complete dissonance with how we are. We're not fear-based, and we don't cling to employees. We want employees to grow and prosper, whatever that might lead them to. We're hoping people stay with us until they retire from the practice of law or go be with the Lord. But we're comfortable with whatever happens, so long as they treat the relationship with dignity in terms of the notice. That's the only time when sometimes it can sting a little bit when someone leaves with short notice.
Yep. Stephen, again, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I know you're going to have something to say here, but I want to put you on the spot here as far as, did you feel like you were provided the room to grow and actually take ownership of your own development? And obviously, as an equity partner, I'm sure you stayed around and I'm sure it's been positive for you, but just talk to me a little bit about that and then whatever else you want to say.
Well, I just
Oh,
want to be
absolutely.
sure, like Stephen is the perfect guy to ask. And so I hope, Stephen, you're going to tell the whole story about, the going and coming back. Because I think that was literally like a Holy Spirit inspired dynamic that actually built out our relationship.
Absolutely. So I can speak to that specifically when it comes to self-growth. And I'll kind of end cap it with what what I truly believe about our vision. But, part of my story is I started as a law clerk. I moved my way up as an associate, senior associate, but there came a time when I felt that I was called to leave and go. I went in-house for a nonprofit organization. It was a agency that helps, it's called Better Together, that helps families stay together. Organization I dearly love, still volunteer with, still do good work for. But I went in-house counsel, became their chief administrative officer, and I actually left the firm. Um, wasn't sure what God was up to, but felt completely called. And that season, for lots of different reasons, came to a close. So I left for, I think it was about 8 months. I was in house with them. And, you know, we don't need to go into all the details, but when you leave an organization and Jim and I are good friends, right? It wasn't great that I left, I'm sure. And I know it wasn't great, but we maintained the relationship as brothers. We worked it out, and I actually stayed with the firm in a much smaller capacity to help through the transition, as a basically almost on a contract basis. Um, and so, but it left the door open, and then I actually returned back to the firm. Um, Came back in, and that's when I progressed into partner and eventually shareholder in the firm. And so, when Jim says I'm the perfect example, it is that I was able to go do what I firmly believe God called me to do, and then come back and continue, right? And there are so many different firms or relationships where that could never even be a possibility,
Mm.
right? The idea that someone would leave and then come back, is just almost out of the question, in a lot of different places. And so, because of that, that's how we are with our folks. And Jim is right in the sense that we want to grow you to who God has called you to be. And whether you're with us for your life or for a season, God has enabled us to be a part of your story, right? If we can help propel you into who you're meant to be, what a gift that it is that we get to be a part of that. That's our view. Again, I often tell people during interviews when I introduce who we are as a firm, I say, look, I don't just put this kingdom stuff on a billboard. I actually believe it. I actually believe that if I could help more lawyers be kingdom minded, that we will move the needle in society. I actually believe that. And so if I can, even if you're here with me for 3 months as a clerk, if I can shift your perspective to how you practice law, and you will go become a Christ-centered, Jesus-following lawyer who's going to change somebody's world someday because you actually introduce them to the man who can solve all their problems, then I'll have done the work that God has set for me to do, right? That's what we actually believe. That if I could release lawyers to be who God has called them to be and to be kingdom minded, that we would actually see good and we would actually see Jesus at the forefront. And that's, you know, so when we say we want you to become who you're supposed to be, we mean it, whatever that might actually be.
Yeah, amen. Well, let me ask you guys about one more thing, and I'll let you guys go so I don't take up too much of your billable hours here, which is work rest. This is a whole section in your blueprint where you talk about the importance of taking time off, not just the PTO thing, but a more specific Sabbatarian rest. And you talk about how in the world that often equates busyness with worth, you guys choose a different path. Can you just talk to me about the kind of culture you guys have tried to embody in regards to that work rest balance?
Yeah, well, specifically with regard to the sabbatical concept, we just deployed that feature and that benefit at the last vision meeting about 3.5 weeks ago. And, you know, there's not time left in our conversation to sort of roll out the benefits of sabbatical, but I don't think it takes some theological exegy to understand that our lives are so full of data, deception, information, requirements, asks, et cetera, that especially then when you're living out life in a law firm, there's like no room for just listening and stillness, which if you look at the life of Jesus, like it was central to Jesus because Jesus only did what he saw the Father do. And whether it was taking a minute after the accusations against the woman who was accused of adultery and the scribes and Pharisees cast her before Jesus and say, look at what she's done. We caught her in the act. And he acts like he doesn't hear them and he draws in the sand. Here is Jesus listening for the Father in terms of the wisdom, because how he rebukes or how he challenges those accusers is like one of the most beautifully profound things that you'll find in Scripture. Well, I mean, day in and day out, if the only time that people who this firm employs, if the only time they get off are weekends or PTO, when we know what they're probably trying to do is put out fires and maybe hang out with friends or family and all the things that we all do on those times off, and we don't give them a specific time where they can be quiet, where they can be by themselves, when they can listen, when they can decompress. I mean, again, the Holy Spirit just put it on my heart. We have to make sabbatical something that's meaningful and that's afforded to people so that they can listen. Again, so that they can become exceptional, so they can succeed along a path from where they are currently to the dream or the vision that God has in their life. So we've given people, in addition to standard PTO, we've given them 4 days a year that are sabbatical days that are paid. And then we've set up criteria. I don't want somebody to take a PTO day adjacent to Memorial Day. We're just encouraging people not to do that. We want people to take the time, turn off their phones, go someplace and have that time to listen to God. Because again, starting all the way back to the beginning of what we talked about, if we're founding a firm ostensibly in pursuit of the author of truth and the author of relationship and wanting to encourage and model that vertical connectedness, I think sabbatical is something that's necessary in anybody's walk.